Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a bookshelf. This was a request by PurpleEmu Studio who wanted me to paint something with books in it, so here it is. Firstly, I decided to just draw it out with pencil first so I can basically just color it in. I used a ruler to make one shelf that will go across this double page spread, and then I'm going to add the knickknacks sitting on top. Since books are going to be the main feature, I decided to place a bunch of them first on the shelf, and I want to alternate the size, like the thickness and the height, and I'm also going to position them differently on the shelf. After I've placed the books, I want to also include some decorations, so I'm going to be painting a couple of potted plants, and at this point I just haven't really decided on the plants that I want to paint, so I just left them empty, and I'm going to continue to draw out more books on the right hand page. I decided to also add a small old kettle or a teapot, and I think it looks really nice in the composition, so I decided to just add that in for decoration as well. This painting does require a bit of drawing, but for those of you who are not very interested in drawing or just want to paint along, I will also have the line art available on my coffee shop as a downloadable. On the left side, I decided to paint a succulent plant, and since this requires a bit of a stronger structure, I decided to draw it out, whereas for the rest of the plants I'm including in this painting, I'm just going to paint them freehand later on. Now I'm just going to finish off the outline by drawing out some designs for the spine of the book, and it's just basically lines that I try to create with different thickness and placement. I'm quite satisfied with the amount of guidelines or outline I have for the composition, and I'm going to start by painting all of the plants first. Here are the colors I'll be using for the plants. I have at the top olive green, then permanent yellow deep, permanent green, cobalt green, and for the succulent here I added manganese blue. So for the base color of the succulent, I just used a mixture of the cobalt green and the manganese blue, and while the paint is still wet, I just added in a bit of the permanent yellow deep into the previous mixture to create a green, and I just added on to some parts of the leaves. Here, since the base color are drier than I would like them to be, the colors are not mingling as much, so I decided to just use my brush to move the paint around and create a softer transition between the colors. I'm going to leave the succulent to dry off for now, and I'm going to move on to painting the next potted plant. I'm just going to use a mixture between the three colors left, which are olive green, permanent green, and permanent yellow deep. So basically I'm just going to alternate the ratio and the consistency between these colors. To start out, I'm using a medium consistency to first create the base color of the leaves, and I'm just going to build up the layers little by little, and as I mix the paint, I don't mind if the tones of greens are slightly different. In fact, that is actually what I'm looking for, so I'm just basically trying to place the leaves first with the same consistency, then I'm going to slowly build with a thicker consistency for the darker colors. Whenever I want parts of the leaf to overlap a certain object, like the pot or the book in this case, I just erase a little bit of a section there so the pencil mark doesn't show up underneath the leaves. As an example of the darker green, I just added a very thick consistency of the olive green, and I just used the tip of my brush to paint some of the stems. You can also switch to a smaller brush here, but since this is kind of a loose painting, I decided to just stick with this one unless I really need it. Once I have a good amount of leaves, I also started to paint some of the leaves hidden at the back, and as for those leaves, I chose to use a darker color, so I used a thicker consistency with more olive green in the ratio, so the leaves in front are a bit lighter than the ones hidden at the back. At this point, I also like to start adding some textures on the leaves by layering the same color mixture, and I just paint following the placement of the midribs and the veins of the leaves while leaving some negative space so the base color still shows. And I'm just basically going to alternate adding more leaves and layering on the textures until I have a fairly bushy plant. Here I moved back to the succulent since they're completely dry now, and I used quite a thick consistency of the olive green to add some shadows in between the leaves, and I also paint some of the leaves which are facing inwards to further develop the form of the leaves. On the right hand side, I decided to add trailing leaves, which might be from a plant on the top shelf or however you'd like to imagine the composition, but I'm just going to follow the same color mixtures as I used for the plants in the middle. But this time, I first started out by painting the main vine first so I can just place the leaves around it, but I would suggest for you to use a thinner consistency than what I used and paint a thicker consistency after you've placed some of the leaves so the darker color of the vine is not obstructing some of the leaves which you might want to place in front. Again, I'm going to place more trailing leaves as decoration on the shelf this time, and I decided to create heart-shaped leaves. I just used the same colors as before, starting with a thinner consistency, then slowly building up the leaves until I get the thickness or the bushiness that I desire. You can also use different shaped leaves compared to what I'm doing here, but I just want my plants to all look slightly different since I'm using similar colors, so I prefer the leaf shapes to be a bit different from all the other plants. Here I'm just basically using a very old brush and the tip is very frayed, which is why it's a bit hard for me to create those finer lines. But as I mentioned, since this is going to be a looser approach, I don't really mind it too much. But feel free to switch your brush whenever you need to. You don't have to follow what I'm doing here exactly. Just try to enjoy yourself and paint comfortably. I'm fairly happy with the amount of leaves I've got here, so to add on the details, I just used a thin consistency of any of the green mixtures I have left on my palette, and I paint the veins and the midrib according to how the leaves are positioned on the vines. As for the darker colored leaves, I use a very thick consistency of the olive green to add those details. And whenever you feel the need to, you can always go back to the previous plants to add on more leaves, details, or shadows to balance out the composition. Moving on to the pot now, I'm going to use buff titanium as the main color, and I'm just trying to create different textures here with what I've got. So I'm alternating the consistency from using a thin consistency to a thick consistency, and I also use the back of my brush so I get quite an uneven texture. For the larger pot, I decided to add burnt sienna and cadmium orange into the buff titanium that I had before, and I'm going to apply it the same way by creating textures and leaving out some white negative space. I also try to layer on a bit more colors so I can have a bit more texture by applying the paint unevenly. Here I'm going to add shadows for the gaps of the leaves. I used a mixture of olive green with burnt sienna, and after this I'm also going to add shadows on the pot from the leaves using a bit of the terracotta pot mixture with the olive green and burnt sienna, and I just painted on loosely. For the handle on the kettle, I used the same terracotta mixture, and as for the body, I want it to be made out of steel, so I used gray of gray as the base color, and then I added graphite gray for the shadow at the bottom and the sides of the body. Some of the books are turned around here, so for the books with the paper exposed, I like to use a mixture of buff titanium with gray of gray or buff titanium with a bit of permanent yellow deep and a very thin consistency to create an off-white color. For the stand underneath the pot in the middle, I want it to be made out of antique gold, so I used yellow ochre as the base color. Then while the surface is still wet, I also added the dark brown mixture from burnt sienna and olive green, and I'm just letting the color mingle to create a loose gradation between the colors. The last color that I'm going to be adding into my palette is Quin red, because I want most of the composition to have warm colors since I'm trying to create sort of like a cozy feeling. So I've decided to use this Quin red to be mixed with other colors that I have here on my palette. I tried to mix this using fairly neutral tones. So for the books on the left, I tried using more of the browns like the yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and buff titanium to mix with the Quin red. But for some of the books, I'm also just going to be using the browns. So basically, by keeping the color palette limited, you're going to be able to create cohesive tones even if you're painting all of the books a different color. Notice how I'm not too worried about painting within the lines since I'm going to be outlining it later on with pen, and I just still want this to be fairly loose. I'm going to go back to the pots here to add additional textures. For the pot on the left, I use a mixture of buff titanium with graphite gray in a dry brush consistency, and I use the side of my brush to create those dry brush textures. I'm going to do the same thing for the terracotta pot using a thick consistency of burnt sienna. For the shelf, I used a mixture of burnt sienna with buff titanium, and I'm just going to paint the whole thing as the base color. I forgot to mention this before, but for the books and the composition in general, I tried to play around with different values. This is very important because if you alter things like vibrancy or value, the overall painting will look more interesting. If not, it will look kind of flat. And as for the books on the right hand side, I'm going to be using Quin red just like before as the additional color to be mixed with the neutral grays this time instead of the brown. So I used gray of gray as well as graphite gray mixed with a little bit of Quin red. This is so it goes well with the steel pot. And I'm just going to be mixing colors randomly again here by alternating the vibrancy as well as the value, but that's basically the thinking process that I've got while I was painting these books. If you ran out of color combinations, you can also mix in a little bit of the browns from the previous color, but I wouldn't go with vibrant colors as the main color of the spine or the cover of the book, just so the color is fairly neutral to go with each other. For the additional design or lines on the spine of the books, I tried using yellow tones like permanent yellow deep or yellow ochre so the colors pop out a little bit more against the neutral tones. But if the color of the spine is fairly light, I used a darker color like burnt sienna or graphite gray in a thicker consistency so the lines will pop out more. For the texture of the wood, I just used whatever brown I have left on my palette, and I used a thin consistency to paint random lines. It doesn't have to be straight. In fact, it can be a little bit messy to create the wood grains. Next here, I'm going to be adding the outline. I'm using my brown pen here, but I ended up switching around with my black pen towards the end. This is not necessarily because I don't like the brown. In fact, I prefer the brown color, but because I only have this thickness for the brown pen, which is 0.5, and I feel like it's a bit too thick for this painting, and I prefer to have lighter lines, especially for the texture of the paper. But basically, I just lined some of the books and the plants using this pen, and as for the smaller details, I ended up switching to my 0.05 size pen, which is very thin to paint the paper texture on the books on the right hand side. You can also add additional textures with your pen, so like the pot here, they're fairly flat in color and it's quite large, so I decided to add random dots and marks to add interest to the painting. And as for the paper, hopefully you can see the difference this pen makes. When drawing out the texture of the paper, it's much finer and it looks less cartoony with this pen compared to the books on the left hand side. But anyway, as for the outline itself, I'm also keeping them fairly loose. I'm not worried about completely straight lines, and I'm not really lining every single object on the composition, especially for things like the leaves. I prefer to only outline some of the lighter colored ones. Now that I've placed most of the flat colors for all of the elements of the painting, I decided to add additional shadows for the background using whatever color I have left on my palette, as long as they're still within the neutral tone to stay within the color theme of the painting. And again, I'm just going to paint it loosely. I'm not too worried about making it too neat, and I'm actually looking for quite uneven textures here. You'll also notice that the brown pen is not waterproof, but I actually don't mind the colors bleeding. I think it looks more loose and interesting that way, and it makes the thick weight from the brown pen look less cartoony somehow. I'm also going to add text to the spine of the books. I couldn't really think of anything interesting, but of course you can write titles of your favorite books, and as for the smaller text, I just did scribbles. For the final touch-ups, I'm going to add more shadows and splatters to give the painting more dynamic. I also added shadows on the spine of the books so they don't look too flat, and I also used a bit of white jelly roll pen to add additional highlights and texture. So that's basically it for this painting. This was super fun. I didn't realize that I would actually really enjoy painting with this style, so thank you for the suggestion. Like usual, all of the list of tools as well as my social media links will be listed in the description box. If you're interested in purchasing the outline, don't forget to go to the link in the description box, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!